Should I try to come downstairs?
Yes, you do. Quicker.
Hurry.
Okay. Both cameras rolling.
Your name, sir?
Lonnie C. King Jr.
Go ahead.
Say it again.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. And
Here we go.
Lonnie C. King, take one.
She's gonna be in the shot.
no.
Mr. King, thank you very much. You gotta get out of the shot, brother. Thank you very much for doing the interview.
It's my pleasure.
Tell us your name and where we are.
I'm not sure where I am. Okay. My name is Lonnie C. King Jr., and I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, in a very prestigious home in the southwest part of Atlanta.
You have lived through many administrations of this city, Mr. King. Take us back to your early activism, 1960, and what was the city of Atlanta like?
Well, the city of Atlanta was unlike.
You need to be, no one's gonna hear my question, so you need to be able to say back in 1960.
Okay, fine.
When you were a young man.
Oh, sure. Back in 1960, when I was a young man going to Morehouse College, Atlanta was as segregated as any small town in the South. Signs were everywhere, colored, white, restrooms, movie theaters, you name it, the parks, totally segregated society. And I guess it's a lot like a famous man once said, there's nothing so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And when those four young boys sat down in Greensboro, North Carolina on February the 1st, 1960, that lit a flame in me and a guy named Joseph Pierce and later on Julian Bond. And we pulled together these 6 colleges and formed a coalition called the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights, or the Atlanta Student Movement. And we challenged the system of apartheid in Atlanta. We began with a publication called The Appeal for Human Rights. And that document was written, published on the 9th of March, 1960. And on March 15th, we began simultaneous sit-ins and demonstrations all over town. There was pandemonium in the town, in the black and the white community. First of all, it was a big shock to the black folks that it was happening, but many of them were very proud. And it was a shock to the whites because they just didn't know that there were that many black folks going to school over there, because they didn't know anything about that part of town except that that's where blacks went to school, or Negroes went to school. And over the next several months, ending up around the next 18 months, because it took a long time for us to bring the white power structure who was running Atlanta to heel. And by that I mean to give them the fact that you've got to go on and do this because this is happening in other places, and there's no reason why it shouldn't happen in Atlanta. But the most important thing that I feel, and I still feel to this day, that brought them to the table to say, let's end this, was when we called a boycott on Richard's department store downtown Atlanta on October the 19th. Martin King was a friend of mine, Martin King Jr. I joined his daddy's church in 1945, and I guess because my name was King and that name was King, I was always around doing something. So I asked him to come go to jail with us because I wanted to put the issue of desegregation into the presidential campaign of 1960, what was going on in the South. 70,000 plus African-American college students were saying, enough is enough. And they were sitting in from Greensboro to Tallahassee, Florida, all the way out to Texas. And it was a situation wherein oftentimes they put so many people in jail until they ran out of jail bunks. They had to get them from some other place. So King did go to jail with us on that date, and before he went to jail with us, Richard Nixon, who was running against John Kennedy at the time, was leading the race by double digits. And he had all the black vote. Black people have been voting Republican ever since Abraham Lincoln, with the exception of Roosevelt and Truman. And they were scheduled to go and vote again for Nixon because the Republican Party had been the one that led us out of slavery and had the reputation for doing that. But once Dr. King went to jail, that put the issue of our inhumanity in terms of what was going on with us on the front pages politically. And it forced Kennedy to take a stand. He didn't do a whole lot except take a stand. It was the lawyers who really got us out of jail. But having said that, Nixon, ironically, also was going to get involved in that, but Eisenhower advised him to not do it. And so that was a classic mistake, I think, on the part of Nixon when we look at it in hindsight, because he might have been able to maintain the black vote. John Kennedy ended the election with 70% of the black vote. And black people are still voting Democratic today because of what happened in 1960 at Richard's department store.
One of the leading black figures in the town of Atlanta at that time was John Wesley Dodd.
Absolutely.
His grandson was Maynard Jackson. How well did you know Maynard?
I met Maynard Jackson in 1948 when I came to David T. Howard High School. Maynard Jackson's sister, John O. Jackson, was one of my best friends. And that happened because my name was King and her name was Jackson. And they sat you during that period of time alphabetically. And so she was sitting right in front of me. And so, for several years, we talked every day. And I've got a chance to meet Maynard. He came over, although he wasn't going to high school at the time. He was going down to middle school, I guess, elementary school. He came over a few times with her. And so I got a chance to meet him as a young man. And of course, our relationship and friendship endured.
So those protests in 1960, I guess Ivan Allen was mayor? Who was mayor at the time?
No, the mayor was a man named William B. Hartsfield.
Oh, the airport.
And he's the guy who took the position that Atlanta is a city too busy to hate. He's the one that coined that phrase. Hartsfield was a segregationist, just like all the white folks who were in charge at that time. But he was a practical segregationist in the sense that he knew, following in the tradition of Henry Grady, that Atlanta's fortune, to a great extent, is going to have to rely on northern capital to be invested here. And capital does not like to invest where there's a controversy. So what he wanted to do was to carry forward Atlanta as a city too busy to hate. It's moderate, bring your capital down here. Now, he didn't start that. Henry Grady started that in the latter part of the 19th century. But Ivan Allen's father, in 1920s, when he was head of the Chamber of Commerce, and many other people kept that tradition going. Now, white Atlanta had no problem with the duality. You preach one thing, but you practice something else.
So by the time we get to Maynard becoming the vice mayor, where were you politically in terms of him as vice mayor and Sam Massell as a mayor?
Well, let me tell you about that story. There were a number of people who wanted to. Maynard ran a tremendous campaign when he ran against Talmadge. I had seen the young man had grown up. I mean, he was really, really good. And because his sister and I had been friends, he and I were friends too. Well, there were some other folks.
Tell the audience about this campaign he ran against Talmadge.
Well, Maynard came back from law school, went to work, I think, for Emory Legal Services or somewhere like that, Neighborhood Legal Services. And so, out of the blue, he decided to run against Herman Talmadge. It was a hopeless campaign.
One seat, though, for what seat?
Oh, for the United States Senate. I'm sorry, yes, for the United States Senate. Maynard did very well, extremely articulate, on the point, knew the issues. So we were then, at this point, looking around. We had changed a lot of the town. They had done a lot of desegregation. The signs had come down, and the law had been changed.
He was running against Talmadge for the U.S. Senate.
Yes.
Who are the we? Who are the we you're talking about? The human rights organization?
Yes, the student movement had changed
Okay.
the
So
town
tell
to a
us
great
that.
extent.
Start again.
Well, we actually changed. We integrated the downtown restaurants, the movie theaters, the opera. We forced the chain stores to hire African Americans in managerial jobs, cashiers jobs, because before that they were able to only sweep brooms and stock. We integrated the recreational centers. The courthouses were even segregated, so we changed all of that too. But there were several thousand students who did that.
So the student movement was called one thing and you became what? What did you become?
Well, I left here and I came back later on, and we can talk about some of that, because by the time we were changing things, and I came back in '68. And when I came back, Dr. Samuel Williams, very eminent theologian and professor at Morehouse, asked me would I accept a position as president of the Atlanta branch NAACP. And I said, Sam, I'm not sure I'm old enough. He said, but I think you can do it. So they put me in as president. And so that put me in the political arena, nonpartisan. And so at that time, we saw all these voters that we put on the rolls. And so Maynard had run for United States Senate against Talmadge. And so we decided that we ought to try to run Maynard for vice mayor, because he made such a great impression. I called him up, and my wife at that time and I went out to sit down with him and Maynard's wife, Bunny. They lived in DeKalb County, and so I said, Maynard, I think we ought to get behind you to run you for vice mayor and then later on mayor. He said, well, I was going to run for city council from this district anyway. I said, let's just see, can we get you to run for mayor? And so he raised the question, well, where are we going to get the money to run the campaign? I said, let me tell you what I think we ought to do. I said, let me go and see Sam Marcel, he and Howard, and talk to them about Sam running for mayor and you as vice mayor on a ticket. So Charles Black, who succeeded me as the head of the movement, and I went to see Sam Marcel at Howard Marcel's townhouse downtown. And we cut the deal. Maynard Jackson for vice mayor, Sam Marcel for mayor. I said, Sam, let me tell you now, this is just one term. We cannot do it a second time. We're grooming him to be mayor. And so we shook hands on the deal. Maynard, of course, won the mayorship, because what I said to Sam was this: you got 17,000 Jewish votes. We've got about 30,000 black votes. We can deliver the black vote if you can deliver the Jewish votes, and I think you can if you run at the head of the ticket. And he said, okay. It was a wonderful campaign. We won it convincingly. However, at the end when we're getting near the end of Sam Marcel's first term, and he liked the mayor's job. And so he decided that he was going to renege on the deal and run for mayor against Maynard. And so he called me to talk about it. I said, Sam, let me just be very candid. We cut a deal at your brother's house. Maynard's going to run for mayor. I said, you can run against it. I said, but we will beat you. Anyway, we ran, Sam ran, and the rest is history. Maynard won it. Maynard Jackson was in my view, it's just my personal opinion, is really the greatest mayor this town has ever had. Maynard Jackson tried to, all kinds of obstacles were thrown in his face because he was first and he was black. And imbued into the very sinew of white Atlanta and really white America is this idea of whites on top, blacks on the bottom, and women on the bottom. So Maynard pioneered the joint venture program, copied by other cities, all over this country, where he had some other black mayors. He did a tremendous job in spearheading the airport. In fact, he did such a great job until when he finished his eight years, it was very difficult for him to get a job in town because most of the jobs were being, and the lawyers were being controlled by the white power structure. And Maynard was being punished, in my opinion, because he was the first black mayor who also tried to do something on behalf of the people that he represented. There probably would never be another Maynard Jackson. He was suave, very articulate, and very forward-thinking.
And he came along at a time when many urban cities had black mayors: Richard Hatcher, Coleman Young, Tom Bradley, Stokes. There were black mayors everywhere. Why does he stand head and shoulders above all those other mayors to you, Mr. King?
Well, I would think that Maynard Jackson had the right bloodline, and that bloodline was John Wesley Dobbs. John Wesley Dobbs, his grandfather, was a very influential person in the city, going back to the turn of the 20th century. He kind of rose to power in the black community after the 1906 riot. Big race riot in Atlanta downtown at 5 Points. Maynard's granddaddy was about 26 at the time, but he was young. He worked on the railroad. He was, I think, a member of the lodge and what have you. But he was one of those persons that was picked to kind of speak for the black community. Now, Atlanta's white leadership realized after that riot that we can't afford to not have some control over these African Americans, or they called us Negroes, I guess, at that time. So they put together an Atlanta-type paternalism, wherein they would select who was going to be, the power structure would select who was going to be the spokesperson for the African American community. So Maynard's granddaddy, John Wesley Dobbs, was one of those persons that was a part of that group. Peter James Bryant was one part of it. He pastored Wheat Street Baptist Church. The powerful preachers in town were a part of that coalition. And John Wesley Dobbs was rather independent, and therefore he was able to handle things. He's the one who coined the phrase, for instance, Sweet Auburn. One of the best orators that I have ever heard. I never saw him use a note to do anything. I mean, when it was time for him to speak, he just turned it on. But let me also say that when we were at the height of boycotting downtown and we were able to get the black community to come out and join us to show that they supported the young folks, one of the major leaders who was infirm at the time, but who could barely walk, but who put on a picket sign and came downtown and joined the line with the students, John Wesley Dobbs. He also did something else that I only learned about recently. I held a press conference as the head of the movement at that time and asked black Atlantans to close down your account with segregation, open up your account with freedom, send me your Richards charge plates, and I will keep them and we'll send them back to you after the boycott is over. 354 people sent me their charge plates. Now, I don't know how many of you would send your charge card to a college student, but that's what happened. But that shows you that we had reached into the very soul of our people, and they knew that we weren't going to steal anything from them, and they trusted us. What I did not know until I was doing some research recently is that John Wesley Dobbs sent his in too, and sent a letter to Richard's department store telling them why he was sending it in. And if you're going to do something about Maynard, it might not be a bad idea to take a good look at what his granddaddy had to say to Richard's department store when he closed down his account in the fall of 1960.
I will. So besides Maynard, successes with joint ventures and the airport, he did face some obstacles in his first 2 terms. I mean, he had a difficult chief, Reggie Eves, right? He also had to deal with the Atlanta child murders.
Well, before Eves, you had another chief of police here by the name of John Inman. And Inman was a part of the old guard. You see, everybody on the police force who was white could, if you were a Klansman, you could get a job on the police force. That didn't start changing until the late 40s, early 50s. John Inman was a relic of that past. And so he highly resented Maynard Jackson becoming the mayor, and for all practical purposes, he was going to defy his boss. And so Maynard chose not to fire him outright, but he forced him out by creating the position of, I guess you would say, Director of Public Safety or Commissioner of Public Safety, and put Reginald Eves in that position. Well, of course, that really upset Inman because he was a step removed from the mayor, and of course he had to work for Eves. So he finally got out, but Maynard did bring forward Reggie Eves. He brought forth a bunch of other positions and other people to go forward and show America, not just Atlanta, that black folks could lead something.
But didn't he have a difficult time with Reggie Eves too?
Well, Reggie and Maynard seemingly got cross-eyed with one another. I have never known the actual behind the scenes. I never asked Maynard, and I never asked Reggie, but I was not unmindful of the fact that apparently these two Morehouse men, whom I had known from Morehouse, got on different pages. But if I had to cast my opinion on it, I'd cast my opinion with Maynard Jackson.
How difficult was it for Maynard during the Atlanta child murders in terms of dealing with the black community?
Distressed.
Just say the Atlanta.
Distressed, because you really couldn't get a handle on it. I mean, it was happening like out of the blue. And I guess that's the best way I can say it, is that it was a very distressing time for him and the city, because no one wants to see any child, it doesn't matter about the color, being abducted, and then you find them in some sewer or some way out place where they've been killed. So that was a stressful time, not just for Maynard Jackson, who was the mayor. It was a stressful time for anyone, any person of goodwill who had a way, who could sympathize with these parents and other relatives who were losing their young loved ones.
I mean, the community must have been, the black community must have been very intense with Maynard about finding the murderer.
Yeah, I never actually witnessed any of that, but I think it's a reasonable assumption that that thing was just caused him all kinds of sleepless nights.
Just say Atlanta child murders for me.
Atlanta child murders.
Good. So how did things go for Maynard when he finished that second term in terms of work and the attitude of the city, you know, the power brokers of the city?
They punished him.
Again, what you tell me.
The power brokers, when Maynard Jackson finished his 2 terms, he had to go to Chicago to get a job, because the powers that be punished him for being the first black mayor, who also was not Uncle Tom. See, you can get along with white people if you're willing to be a Tom. That is, you know, you kind of don't rock the boat and you take your instructions. America, even to this day, you can just look at the president right now who's about to go out. The same thing that happened to Maynard Jackson with whites in Atlanta is happening to our president right now, Barack Obama. But you know, it really goes back to what have you been taught? If you've been taught from the time you were in the cradle to your grave that there are certain positions in life that people who don't look like you, they should not be in, it's very difficult to change that. I think the psychologists call it conditioning. And if you're a strong Bible belt person, you know the Bible verse that says, train up your child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he would not depart from it. That's what has happened throughout the South, Southwest, and to a great extent throughout America. That's why Donald Trump became president.
The same condition.
Same conditioning. He was smart enough to appeal to the racism. See, people talk about the Muslims. The real elephant in the room, with regard from a lot of people in America who were white, was that he was talking about taking America, making it great again when black folks didn't have any rights, that they were bound to respect.
Exactly. So Maynard had a difficult time after it.
He had a difficult time.
So were you surprised when he decided to go for a third term?
No, I wasn't surprised. I was very happy to see him do that.
Why?
Because he was an outstanding mayor the first time around, and I didn't think he was going to be a terrible mayor when he went back around for the second time or the third time.
But this was a different country, different city. I mean, but when he became mayor for the third time, we had Ronald Reagan as the president. You had the crack epidemic. You had AIDS. You had more homelessness. Did he realize he was going to face all of these difficulties? In your opinion?
I don't know. I never discussed that with him. Those issues, but they were out there, as you just said.
What issues were out there? Tell me.
Well, the issues that were out there were the epidemic, the dope epidemic with crack cocaine and what have you. We had another problem too. We had a declining in the revenues in the sense that a lot of whites during this white flight situation, they left town. So that kind of minimized or diminished the population's contribution to the overall city treasury through taxes. So it wasn't a walk in the park to be mayor of Atlanta, Georgia. It was nice and prestigious, but if your money starts drying up on you because your citizens are leaving town, going to the suburbs, taking the money to form new cities out around the suburbs that are white enclaves, it does have a tremendous impact on you. And then Maynard was very instrumental in trying to push for rapid transit, and they passed the referendums and got rapid transit in. But if you look, the highways in Atlanta are built to get you out of town. And if you drive around now, anytime between 6 o'clock in the morning and 10 o'clock in the morning, or between 3 o'clock and 7 o'clock, it is almost impossible to get around these freeways because of all these things. But that's a tribute to people like Maynard Jackson, who made this town into an international city. The reason the city of Atlanta was able to get the 1996 Olympics, it didn't start when Andrew Young and some others appealed to the Africans to come on over here. Atlanta already had a very good reputation of interracial cooperation and so forth and so on. Now, we know it wasn't what it ought to be, but it was better than a whole lot of other places. And so this reputation had been brought forward, and one of the greatest exponents of Atlanta having a great reputation was Maynard Holbrook Jackson.
Great. In his third term as mayor, he also had to deal with, how do you think he effectively dealt with when the Rodney King verdict came through in 92? I mean, he went out to talk to the students. You had been a student back in 1960. Was there, and he didn't get through to the students. Why? Why do you think? And just say back
during the Rodney King crisis, it was very difficult to quell the young people who were activists. Injustices of that kind serve as a catalyst for action from young people. You can see that with the most recent presidential election. Maynard was in a difficult position. He's now the chief executive officer of the city. He's over all the police department. And the police did this thing out there to Rodney King, and of course we know it was being done in a lot of other places too, but just didn't have the publicity. But in a way, Maynard had to run with the foxes and chase with the hounds, because it's not just white people who wanted protection or who wanted to be taken care of by the city in terms of public safety, but it was black people too. So that put him in a very difficult position, but I think he handled it with aplomb.
Did you think the students were, I mean, you being a former activist, I mean, still an activist, but being a former young activist, did you think the students had a valid point in raising the ire of their anger?
Whenever you are going through, in my opinion, difficult times, oppressed times, you may find that the younger people who are oppressed are more restless and who are not willing to, they want freedom now, not 2 years or 3 years from now. When you get a little older, you become a little bit more settled. But I don't think young people ought to be settled. Young people ought to be restless. Because if you're not restless, there won't be any change. You cannot bake a great cake without mixing a few things up and then allowing those things to come out with a glorious end result. Young people need to be active, but and I won't say criticism, one be a bit of advice I would give to the folks who are in the Black Lives Matter is that they need to sit down and put together a plan of action. They're in a war, the same war that we were in. It's still going on. They need to figure out where are the weak ends or where are the weaknesses that they can exploit that can bring about the changes that they want to bring about. The thing that made the difference in Atlanta, Georgia in 1960 was the economic boycott of the downtown Atlanta, Georgia, where black people turned in their credit cards. They stopped shopping downtown. They wore old clothes with new dignity. And you can get support if you have an organized thrust. A march is just a sign of frustration. You can publicize it, but marches do not solve anything. They arouse those in conscience, but when the march is over, you got the same situation. You got to work on the problem. And what is it that I think people who are involved in Black Lives, they have a tremendous number of people working. Can you imagine what would happen if the Black Lives Matter were to sit down and take a good look at the power of the black dollar and other people who are sympathetic to the black dollar and what it could do? Just in Georgia alone, the African-American gross domestic product is greater than the country of Canada, of a lot of other countries. But the difference is that the money is not harnessed. This is a capitalistic country. It operates on land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. If you begin to impact that capital, you can get some concessions. You don't have to worry about whether or not the law is there. I remember when we started this boycott in downtown Atlanta, I was told by powers that be in the white community, it will never happen. I never will forget what Dr. Mays, the president of Morehouse College, said in one of those Chamber of Commerce meetings to the guy from F&W Woolworth, who was the regional vice president down here. He said, Atlanta will never integrate. We will never do that. Very emphatically. And Dr. Mays said, never is a long time. And of course we proceeded. And who was in the meeting when we, about a year later, when they had to sign the agreement to desegregate? That same man was there. But the bottom line is that he didn't do it because he wanted to do it, but they were losing money.
When Maynard decided not to run after that third term, were you surprised? So you should say when Maynard decided not to run.
When Maynard decided not to run for that, I guess you would say fourth term, I was a little surprised because I thought maybe he might have 2 8-year terms. But on the other hand, I guess he probably figured he had to do something for his family and what have you. But he'd made his mark. He had made his mark, and I think he probably decided, 12 years is enough. Right. I was disappointed, though, that he didn't run.
Why?
Because, I'd known him since 1948 and a good friend, and I found him to be a mayor of integrity, articulate, on the issues, convivial. The only thing that kept Maynard Jackson from being universally accepted by whites and blacks was that he was a black man. And the folks who were not black I guess they had some kind of a resentment that their world had changed because they had never in their lifetime seen a person of color be the chief executive officer of a city.
But this is a city that's had black mayors for almost 50 years.
Yeah, and I'm a little stressed out about some of that too.
Why?
Well, I don't know what happened, but when you go back and drive through areas that you grew up in and you see the devastation and the ill-kept, well, not roads, but housing and stuff like that, you begin to wonder, what happened? When you look at on the evening news and you see these young fellows who've been arrested or whatever, and then you follow that out and you see where they lived, where their mother and father lived, where their grandparents lived, great-grandparents lived, you begin to see that a few people who are African Americans were able to traverse the opportunities that were out there, but a large number of African Americans today are in the same position that their great-grandparents were, kind of at the bottom. And what I think what I'm really concerned about is the fact that the school system has let us down. And what I mean by that is this. The movement of the 1960s with all those college kids changing things all over the South, very little of that, if any, is in any of the history books. It's almost like it never happened. Now, why is that? Let me give you my theory. America beat in World War II the Germans, the Japanese, and the Italians all in 47 months. They won that battle. Now, you're going to tell me that white America cannot win the battle over racism if they can beat all those folks militarily? But what happened here is that college kids, with Martin King being the moral leader, but the college kids went out there and they won a non-violent battle without any weapons except their actions, which put onto the conscience of white America and then the white South the inhumanity that was going on, this separation. So they won that battle, but it has been whitewashed. The history books in Atlanta, Georgia, they changed them about 25 years ago, got rid of civics. Civics teaches a young kid about city councilman, alderman, all that stuff. They changed all that. And they have put into the books, because I've seen the standards, that you should teach about Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, genius, quiet from Tuskegee, and Frederick Douglass. How can you do that in a city that had a man named Alonzo Herndon, who ex-slave, who came to town, walked, and put together Atlanta Life Insurance Company that ended up being a $100 million institution that was helping black folks in 17 states? How can you have out of the history books J.B. Blayton, the first black CPA in America, who helped form Mutual Federal Savings and Loan? I can go on and on and on. The first black junior high school, the first black senior high school in the South. How can you leave that out? If it's out, it's only because the folks who write the books want to leave it out. And then finally, we had 247 years of slavery to a great extent in this country. How can you tell the story of slavery in one chapter in a history book? 247 years. So what I'm saying is that if I had any misgivings about what's going on now, we allowed the enemies of African Americans to whitewash our history. And therefore, young folks coming along have no brain cells of recognition because nobody has talked to them about it. We didn't want to talk about segregation because it was a horrible situation. My great grandparents were slaves, and my granddaddy told me that he could never get his daddy to talk about slavery. You don't want to tell your children bad news. You don't want to do that. But we need to go on and tell the bad news. It's not a matter of hating anybody. It's a matter of being more positive about who we are.
Yeah, so we can never forget. We can never forget. So when Maynard left office after that third term, how was he received in the business community then?
I think that was more acceptance of him at that moment. Certainly more so than when he did the. See, you say Maynard was one of those in your face. If he had to be, he'd do it with a smile, but he's very, very consistent. We had to change the way Atlanta had been doing business. And he did that. And almost everybody who came after him, really who was black mayors, then their legacy goes back to Maynard Jackson. There's no way you can look at it any other way.
Andy Young, Bill Campbell.
They all were following in Maynard Jackson's footsteps. Right. He was the Moses.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Maynard Jackson was the Moses of his time when it came to political participation. Because he not only influenced people in Atlanta, he was so articulate until he could influence people all over the country, make tremendous speeches. The guy was a chip off of John Wesley Dobbs' tree.
Great. Where were you the day Maynard passed away?
I was at home, and the news flashed, and I was shocked. I had just seen him a few days earlier. I was absolutely shocked. I don't know what that was all about, or maybe he had some. I know his sister Jono died early, my good friend, and his other sister died kind of early. So maybe it's a hereditary thing. I don't know, but I was personally devastated.
He was a huge man. He did.
Well, yeah, he tried to lose the weight. Now he tried to lose that, but I don't know exactly what happened. But I do know that three of them died. They were all friends of mine. Died early.
Mr. King, give me a Maynard Jackson anecdote, a story about Maynard that you remember fondly, or that was funny, or a story about Maynard.
I can't remember any of those things that you're asking about on that one. Maynard Jackson, in my view, was always extremely serious. And I was never around him to have him bring forward anything other than a serious Maynard Jackson. Now, he and I were together in Boston while he was mayor for a conference or something up there. But he was always, how should I put it? I didn't run around with him as a social friend, so I haven't seen these moments when maybe he had his guard down. But every time I saw him, he was morally straight, well-dressed, articulate, on the point. So, but I never saw the other side of Maynard Jackson. I'm sure there was this nice, funny side, but I never saw it.
So what was he? Would you say was it morally straight? What was those things you said?
Oh, I don't know, man. It just kind of comes out.
What's his legacy, Mr. King?
I think Maynard Jackson's main legacy will be the airport, the joint venture thing, trying to get people who look like him a piece of the action. That's what I think is going to, because no one has been able to do it, in my opinion, the way Jackson was doing it. Now, maybe they didn't have the opportunities to build an airport and all those kind of things. But I think one reason why you have a lot of African Americans who say, well, why should I vote? Things won't change. That's self-defeating. Things will change if you go out and vote and hold your people accountable for making things happen for you.
I think I have it. Wendy?
Yes, sir.
Anything else?
Oh, she was watching on another screen.
Yes. So you said old clothes and what now?
Wear old clothes with new dignity.
Old clothes.
Don't shop downtown.
Old clothes and new. I got that one. That one going home with me.
Okay, let's get a minute. Room tone.
Alrighty.
Just be quiet for 1 minute.
A new segment here. We're gonna call this.
Room tone for Lonnie C. King.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you all very much.